everybody. We're on a bit of a Stormgate kick as of late, and why wouldn't we be? I mean, after all, here we are going through some more of Artosis' content. He has shown yesterday a video that shows what the new Infernals look like for the Stormgates, the second faction that we know of, and while a fourth one is speculated, and a third one is all but outright confirmed, and has been stated in pre-interviews that it is in fact going to be coming and will be the case, this is what we know of for now, and I think the extra value add for those of you watching, if you don't want to see my speculating and my gesticulating and my pontificating, is you can go onto the Bang Infernal Stats to go and get a link for a Reddit thread that I have put on r/Stormgate, where we go over all the unit stats that are shown inside of this video. Now, I want to preface this, I want everyone to understand this, right? Let's not go too wild with this. This is a beta, right? This is probably at this point not even quite a beta. Its values and the valuations of all of these stats and these units will change. How fair and balanced they are will change. The relative parity between the factions will change. The build orders that we're going to see in games later down the road, all of this is going to change. But that doesn't mean that it's meaningless. We get a sense of what the current people under NDA and the designers of the game are looking at when we take a look at these hard stats. And we can also use that as a benchmark to see, oh, was that actually as overpowered as we thought? Well, they had a bunch of tournaments for money and with literal pro players from other games. Oh, it actually got buffed, so it looks like the problem was a meta problem or a skill issue. Oh, wait, that got nerfed. That unit got changed around entirely. And in a couple of years, hoping that Stormgate is extremely successful, we can come back and have a laugh at what the statistics were for all of those units, and we can say, "Ha, that was hilariously overpowered," or "Ooh, they needed to let that one cook. Like, get some marination in there." You know what I mean? Like they were trying a little too little with that one. So, couple of things I want to get into before we get into Artosis' video. So, first thing I want to talk about is Infernals. He mentions that Infernals play a lot like Zerg. Now, he's probably played the game, right? He certainly seemed to be more knowledgeable than a first-time viewer when he and Tasteless were casting the game over at games over at DreamHack Atlanta. So, strong reason to suspect that he is actually legitimately part of the game, part of the group, right? He probably knows more, right? I don't think that's too much tinfoil hat to say that. Now, he says that they played a lot like the Zerg, and I actually don't see that. I understand where he's coming from. There are some mechanics that seem very Zerg-inspired, especially the StarCraft 2 Zerg inspiration, but I actually feel it plays a lot like Rax, or the Barracks faction in LittleWarGame. We're going to talk about that. So, before that, and after that, we're going to get on to the next thing, which is he's going to mention white health. And we're going to see formal documentation that calls the bar of health white health for the Infernal faction. I want this to be called Veil. We need this to be called Veil. It just makes sense thematically. The aliens or the demons or the Infernals are coming from a portal out in space or from another dimension or from outside of our space-time, however you want to call it. They seem like they have come through a Stormgate, right? They have come through some kind of gate, some kind of portal. The thing they generate around themselves that gives them bonus health is called, that is from their shrines and their Shroudstones, right? Which has like a quasi religious slash mysterious slash occulted like feel vibe to it. And then that generates a thing called Shroud, and then the Shroud gives white health. No, the Shroud gives Veil, because what is a Shroud? A Shroud is itself a Veil. And what is a Veil? It is like the guardian of what is seeable to what is unseen. It is the thing that renders opaque your understanding or your comprehension of what's behind it. It's perfectly fitting considering that these units are coming from through some kind of external gate where previously humanity was presumably not bothered by all of these things or knew anything about this dimension or these Infernals. It just makes sense. We're going to call white health Veil. I'm not backing down on this, right? Until they come up with an official name, I'm calling it Veil. And I want you to call it that too. It also sounds so much better than white health, white health, white health, white health, white health. Say that 5 times fast and you realize we just need a better name for it. So, we've cranked up the volume from the previous go so that people can actually hear what Artosis is saying. Let's go ahead and do that. And obviously, if you're like one of the 0 people on the internet who know of me and know of my content and know of LittleWarGame, but you've for some reason never heard of Artosis, When this gets brought over to YouTube, we're going to have descriptions and links to all of Artosis' socials, including the links to this original video. And I do want to thank him for giving me permission to react to the Vanguard video that was presented a couple of days ago, and by extension, this one. If I am wrong in that belief, then we'll get from there. Anyways, that's enough preview. Let's go forward.
Hey guys, Artosis here. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit about Stormgate and the Infernal faction. The Infernal is the second faction revealed in Stormgate. They seem to most resemble and play like Zerg from StarCraft 2. Their worker unit, the Imp, has to sacrifice itself to make buildings. They also get an advantage from a dark cloudish thing that spreads around their shrines, which is the main production building, and Shroudstones. This is called Shroud.
Yes.
It is important to note that standing on Shroud generates white health for Infernal units.
So I want to notice a couple of things analytically that are different, right? So for white health, it's true that the Shroud gives a benefit to these units, but I want you to understand that it seems currently, and from what we have from the DreamHack Atlanta games, to function much the same way as Creep, in that Creep benefits both players in a ZVZ, right? Your Creep that boosts your Zerg units boosts my Zerg units if my Zerg units get on top of it. And right now, this is not a movement speed buff. Actually, it seems like Vanguard has like all of the pieces bound together. I'll do a video or some content on this later where I talk about what both factions want to do. Vanguard is very much about movement speed, mobility, etc. So Shroud doesn't generate creep, it generates Veil. It generates this bonus white health. And I want to note that just food for thought, if we ever get into Infernals v Infernals, it's probably not optimal. Unless you are doing a very specific kind of rush, to go ahead and expand your Shroud if you think you have the weaker army. So I suspect that defensively, people will not generate as much Shroud in this particular matchup. But anyways, he's going to talk about Veil now.
Which acts similarly to Protoss Plasma Shields. When Infernal units are off the Shroud, though, they will lose this white health over time. The Infernal also have a very interesting, somewhat Zerg-like production. They make something kind of like charges of units that fill up over time on a given structure. When the charge is full, if you choose to make the unit, it will be created instantly. You can bank up to 3 of these charges at the time I'm making this video, which allows you to make decisions on spending in a more delayed manner, kind of similar to how Zerg functions with Larva.
So I want to make some comments on this. So first off, with the idea that they just consume the Imp, which is the basic worker unit, in order to make a building, seems very Zerg-like. Looks like the supply goes down. I will note that this is it's a little similar because Imps can actually transform later on. We'll see into what he calls essentially Banelings, and so there is an army opportunity cost. I want to talk about this mechanic of Veil that he doesn't go into explicitly here, but if you go into the Bang Infernal stats command that I have for the stream, you will in fact see this. Veil looks like it averages out, and then let's say the most common representation of the amount that you get of Veil is 50% of your hit points. So notice that we have these Imps here. These are our worker units. These, according to what we can find later clicked on in this, are going to have 80 hit points but 40 Veil, right? And this is a pretty common trend for something to have 50% of its health as Veil. I do want to note,
now,
here, let's see, one pound.
Which allows
The production structures that he was talking, or the production method he was mentioning previously, from what we could see in the bottom left-hand side, it looks like units that are of the same tier accrue their charges individually, but for the most part, your unit's accrual rate doesn't impact your ability to create others of that unit. Now, this has interesting tech tree and macro implications. So let's think about this. If you have a conclave, let's say you have an iron, let's see, not an iron citadel. Give me a second. Still getting all of the names in my head. If you have an iron vault, right, and your iron vault has the ability to produce or brutes, right? It doesn't also have the ability to produce gaunts, right? That's an ability specifically of the conclave. And so we're going to see this repeatedly. Notice that even when we have a lot of units that we can create, there's only about 3 of them in any one building. And what this means is that each of our individual buildings, because it looks like the charges build individually and can be expended individually, but don't react or have any impact on others, it actually looks like you want a proportion of buildings relative to how many units you can build in that structure. So this is like a little advanced. So let's stretch it out a bit, okay? So he's got a click here on a shrine that has 2 units, right? Let's say he wants to have 2 of these buildings, right? Now let's think logically. If we have the ability to create units instantaneously in 0.5 seconds, it's not instant, by the way, it's 0.5 seconds. That's the way it's represented in tooltips. Which again, if you go to the command bang infernal stats, you'll actually get a link to the Reddit post on our Stormgate that goes over what some of these hard statistics are, so I don't pad the time of this unnecessarily, because people say they want analytical content, but then what people really want is to be entertained and to follow the analytical content on their own time, or just know that it's there so they can have like, ah, yes, this person is smart, yes, I haven't fed into their information, but they seem very intelligent, yes. So anyways, not banging on any of you who are watching, but let's think about this. If I want to make a unit, let's say the brute's the only unit that can be made inside of this building for the Infernals. I probably want to make 3 or 4 of that building, because the only thing that's going up on the unit ticker to generate the possibility of spawning that unit in 0.5 seconds is that one unit, right? But if I have a unit that maybe there's 4 possible choices in, I may only want one of those. So let's think about a couple of reasons why. You spend the resources immediately. And what that means is that if there's only one choice of unit there, then you don't have to have a if-then question or analysis of what you want to make. Is the charge available? Yes, you make the charge, right? Unless you want to store up Luminite and Therium so that you can expend it later for a defense. We'll get to why you maybe don't want to do that, or why you may be encouraged to do that later. But if you have 4 units and they're all on their individual bar, then that is a question of what do you use in this particular circumstance, and it's probably redundant to have more than one of those. In LittleWarGame, we have tech buildings that do much the same thing, right? Like the Werewolf's Den, right? You can only make in a wolf's den, the normal unit, you can make wolves and sometimes snakes, but you can never make werewolves. So in order to make a werewolves, you have to upgrade the wolf's den into a werewolf's den. Now let's think about this. Are you going to be making lower tier units in your building that specifically you upgraded to make werewolves, these more powerful tier 2, tier 1.5, tier 2, tier 2.5 units? Probably not. Same thing's going to happen here for Infernals. The more options that are inside of that building, the fewer of them you're going to make, and the fewer options are in that building, the more of them that you're going to make. And so instead of, we're going to start seeing people who are thinking about the game in an analytical context talk about the imp efficiency of making these units, because unlike hatcheries, right, let's think in StarCraft 2, hatcheries are extremely efficient for the drone in terms of unit producing. You turn one drone into a hatchery, and that hatchery can kick out larvae for the rest of the game to make all of your units. The difference here is that each one of these buildings is a mini hatchery. And so much how we talk about the supply efficiency of Zerg units or the larva efficiency of Zerg units, and those are 2 very different things. Sometimes they align, usually and on purpose they don't. I think we're going to get to the point in Infernals where we're talking about the imp efficiency. How many charges are you getting out the gate when you turn this imp into this building? And what is the unit variety that you're getting? Something to think about. I don't want people to fall too much in the trap of thinking it's exactly like hatcheries, because I think there is going to be this inverse relationship.
You to make decisions on spending in a more delayed manner, kind of similar to how Zerg functions with larva. Now that you've got some of the basics down, let's talk about the actual units. So first up, the Iron Vault and the Conclave are both tier 1 structures, but
The stats for both of these, by the way, quick note for anyone who wants to cheese this and get some points on Reddit. Every 50, so up until the last bar, every one of these bars is 50 hit points. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, this has about 400 of its hit points left, and I believe it has 1,000 health total. Now, this last bar can be 1 hit point, or it can be 40, or it can be 50 hit points, right? So if it had 1,001 or 1,050, it would have the same number of bars. But usually, unless there is a unit that seems specifically to have been nerfed or buffed to account for this, think of Bobs, which have 130 hit points, right?
But we're going to talk
You
about
can
the
count
Iron
with that.
Bolt.
Yeah. Stats are in
Since that
Infernal
has
stats.
kind of like the most basic unit, a unit that only costs Luminite. And that unit is the Brute.
For anyone who's hopelessly out of the loop, Luminite is gold. And the reason I say Luminite is gold instead of Luminite is minerals is that the way that units gather up on minerals makes AoE attacks against those workers in StarCraft 2 useful. And because of the general DPS density of units and how quickly the game runs, this is something Brown Bear talks about. Yes, harassment is very good in StarCraft 2, but notice that they're going to 8 mineral patches, right? Standard to have 2 Vespene geysers and 8 mineral patches. And that means that the workers, really, there's only 2, maybe 3 of them on each mineral patch. The reason I say gold is that this is a lot like Luminite functions a lot like LittleWarGame, in which units that are mining the Luminite walk up to the Luminite, mine it, and then back out away. And that means that there's actually a point, 1, of diminishing returns as each one is mining them, and 2, that they clump up towards the center. So even though StarCraft 2 is going to have higher DPS, I want you to think of Luminite as giving a better opportunity for harassment to be directly rewarded. Really? Death and taxes on this ad. I did not ask for this ad. Nobody asked for this ad. Cool. Okay.
Cool. Luminite. And that unit is the Brute.
Again, notice this. You can go to the Infernal stats command on Reddit to get a link. But 190 health, 95 Veil. Pretty common trend.
When trying to figure out how to relate this incredibly original unit to another unit from RTS, the closest I could come up with is a reverse Zerg Archon. So basically, the Brute is a pretty big, strong, kind of medium speed melee unit.
Yeah, 285 effective hit points if it has max Veil, but it probably won't ever have max Veil because in a scenario like this where you're attacking off of Shroud.
And it has an ability which allows the Brute to split into 2 smaller units called Fiends.
Fiends are 60 hit points, 30 Veil. I want you to note specifically that Fiends have half of their Veil, half of their possible Veil generated when they split. Doesn't matter if they're on Shroud or off of Shroud. And so those are effectively 75 hit point units that are rapidly decreasing in health, as Artosis is about to mention.
The split can't be undone, and it's not automated either. It's something that you are going to have to micro each and every time to get done before the Brute ends up dying. So kind of the opposite of an Archon there, where you might take a couple of Templars and make a powerful unit. This is a powerful unit you're going to split into smaller units.
Yes.
And this actually brings us to one of the most important units for the Infernals, which is what the Brute splits into, the Fiends.
Again, Fiends are 60 hit points, 30 Veil as of the PTR, or as of the Bisu PTR that's being demonstrated in this video.
Fiends cannot be directly created out of any structure. You can only get them through splitting Brutes or infest abilities, which I'll talk about a little bit later. The Fiends are very much like Zerglings from StarCraft 2. They're low health, high damage, easy to swarm, and very fast. One of the most interesting things about Fiends is that they naturally lose health over time. While this may sound like a huge disadvantage,
yes,
it opens up some really interesting plays, such as keeping them on Shroud to have that white health regeneration, keep them alive, or to take down a health camp to heal them up as well.
Okay, so before we continue on, I'll pause on something else that looks more aesthetically pleasing. Okay, cool. So I want to talk about this. Brutes are... There's 2 possibilities. One is that Brutes are weaker than Fiends. that's just kind of not the case, given that we have seen multiple players. Both we've seen streamers during the DreamHack week up leading up to DreamHack Atlanta. We saw the DreamHack Atlanta games, and we have also seen Mapo TV and some other people show replays that show that brutes are actually pretty good at standing and delivering and doing damage. So the fiends or the fiend split is actually a micro potential. Now there's a couple of things I want you to pay attention to. Easy questions to ask yourself, and then more complex questions. One, I want you to note that every time that the fiends split in this video, you can see that they seem to burst and leap out of the brute. And we have seen scenarios where if you frame by frame it, they seem to be able to get around pathing, like a trapped pathing issue for the brute that they were before they split. So can you split brutes near a ledge and jump over the ledge? Are they actually flying? Probably not. Can you use them to get out of entrapment or encirclement? Yes. Or out of a cage scenario. Yes, you probably can. If the brute is being micro down or held in place, does this break CC? Because these are generating 2 new units out of it. Are those units now affected? If you are under the effects of a buff, do the fiends get the buff? Probably not. But if you're under a stun or some debuff like that and you activate this, will those new fiends be subject to that debuff? Basically, if we were talking about this like it was the Java programming language, right? Can we build the animal class and then can we make these children of, are the fiends treated as children of the fiends, or are the fiends treated as children of the brutes? Do they have buffs and debuffs associated with them? Are they no collision when they split? These are all things that you think might not matter up until the point that someone will find a way for it to matter. I'll give you an example very quickly from LittleWarGame. In LittleWarGame, when a unit makes a building, the worker making the buildings tries to be in the center area, build the building if they're in that central area, and then gets displaced out to the side. Now, strong players found out on a very specific set of maps that there was a map that was considered like really easy to get your expansion, totally safe to get your expansion as greedily as possible, very hard to cheese because it's on a double high ground, and even the natural itself was on a high ground. People found the exact pixel they would have to plant their worker so that they could build a house so that the worker would get displaced up the double high ground rather than around on the low ground. These are the kinds of things that you should really worry about for this brute split. Someone will find something associated with this, right? Don't know how, don't know when, don't know how much setup they will have, or if it's even practical, but make no mistake, it will be done. Second thing I want to talk about for these units is that I actually don't think, even though they have some Zerg-like qualities, I don't think of this faction of the Infernals as Zerg. I think of the Infernals very, very much so like Rax, like straight up Rax play from LittleWarGame. Soldiers, archers, mages, no catapults, none of this other mech transition stuff. And what are the characteristics of Rax? Very strong if they can force you to take the fight, very slow, and there's a lot of games that you win at a lower level. This may feed into the Mapu TV replays that we've seen and some of the tournaments games that people have seen. Very strong when your opponent's builds aren't mapped out. Very strong when your opponent's game knowledge is not sufficiently checked. Now, the metagame for LittleWarGame as it currently exists in AA4 has been going on for a couple of years with tournaments that are of noteworthy prize pools, so people were encouraged to figure this out. We had pro leagues and some things like that. But it wouldn't surprise me that this looks very overpowered at first. I want to note a weakness is that especially because the fiends die over time, every time you split a brute, okay, if we use the LittleWarGame Rax analogy, you wouldn't want to lose a soldier, which is very much like a brute, because that delays your push. That delays your ability to take a safe expand. That delays your ability to push out with a Doom force that the more supply inefficient army of your opponent's faster units cannot compete with. So, while it may be good to split a brute to take care of your opponent's starting Vanguard scout or to get some information, I think that every time you split a brute, you are telling on yourself that you are delaying your push. And we will start seeing, much like we have people counting how many packs of Zerglings they need to deal with a Reaper, or how many packs of Zerglings they need to clean up and get some map attention over, at this point in the game, or to search for this particular interaction, or to put on some pressure, right? Much as even I hear about that through the filtered prism of people who are themselves grandmasters trying to communicate that point down to me, and I still have heard of it and know about it, I think we're going to see the same thing happen here with brutes. The more you split them, the more you delay your doom push, and in exchange you're hoping the micro harass potential that you have generated and the vision that you get of your opponent is worth it. I also suspect, just going off of a tangent that I had earlier, that the ability for brutes to split into fiends was decided upon before. I suspect that that was decided upon before Vanguard started with a scout unit, right? I don't know that. I just strongly suspect, because we have seen how quickly these fiends burst out, and we have seen that the way that Infernals generate things is like big time, go, 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 fast, fast, fast. Like start with 2.5 bars or 3 bars of units, make, and then if you split them all into some fiends and they go, your opponent might lack the information to know that that's coming. So I suspect that this was made, then the decision to give players a starting scout was made. Again, could be wrong.
Or to take down
I've just seen this way too many times before.
a health camp to heal them up as well.
I actually think that that is... I feel like the best use of fiends is going to be griefing your opponent's creeping, and to have... you're going to have to split at least one to get across the map and see what your opponent is doing and check their unrelenting greed, right? And to know if you're getting all in. I feel if you're against, and if you're in a mirror, you probably want to find out what your opponent is doing, and are you going to die to them having too many brutes? And Vanguard, are they creeping too much? I don't think you want to take a split brute that has lost health, come off of Veil for its fiends, and take these like 45 hit point kind of somewhat leftover units and try to take creep camps with it. But I do think you're going to be doing something like we saw TLO do in game 2 against Mana, where you're going to use the fiends, kind of like TLO used the scout, to try and harass your opponent while they're creeping, steal the creep, in addition to getting the information, because it doesn't look like it's much of a stand and deliver unit. I mean, you saw how it was maneuvering around all of those Lancers and getting completely wrecked, even though they weren't standing in the Lancers AoE the entire time.
Next from the Iron Vault is the Magmadon.
I love this unit.
The Magmadon is pretty expensive, and
again, notice the trend here. Again, you can go to Bang Infernal Stats for the command, and you'll be able to see all of the things in a Reddit post that show, oh, well, this is what the health and values are of this thing. Isn't that interesting? But something I want you to notice is, again, 480 health, 240 Veil.
Quite a bit higher in tech than the Brute.
Yes.
It's also a melee unit, but it has a special ability it starts with called Crushing Charge.
That's interesting, because Crushing Charge looks like it ignores terrain. Not terrain, it looks like it ignores unit pathing. And this reminds me, actually, of a unit from... It was in a public tournament. I could talk about it. It reminds me of a unit that existed in the 2016 game of Guardians of Atlas. You might know it as the Day 9 RTS. There was a faction in it called Blue, and they had units that would jump and cannonball into an area, and they would have a slow, sometimes a stun, but usually a slow. And that's how they would engage. I think that some communication here on this would be appreciated, because it looks like it slides and ignores the pathing. I would be curious to see if you could ignore the pathing. Like if you could tell them to slide, and you could just wave dash the Magmadon. But I don't think anything janky like that is going to happen. I do want to note that it's purely a debuff.
But it has a
like, look at the
special
health.
ability.
So again, these are Lancers. Lancers have, I think, 230 or 240 hit points, and I want you to note that that last bar of about 40 hit points only gets chunked about halfway through. The AoE is pretty generous. Like, look, he's landing on top of one, but not around the others. This looks like a 20 to 30 damage stun. and the
called
duration
Crushing Charge.
is 1 second. Now, this looks like it's utility, and the reason I say that is that this poor thing just does not have the relative health. Again, in the Reddit, we have some information if we click on it about some of its stats and some of the ways it does damage. There was also talk previously that the Magmadon does bonus damage every third time it hits or something to that effect. That's not commented on here, but then again, this is probably made as a video to be snazzy, not to appeal to the people like me who are trying to go over it frame by frame, preening our eyes for some of that primo content. The reason this unit really matters is that anything that is trying to be snazzy with movement speed probably hates this unit. And what I mean by that is that this is probably a bad unit with a great ability. Like, think about how Exos want to shoot and run. Lancers get faster every time that they have damage dealt to them, right? CC Rex units that love movement speed.
This allows the Magmadon to slide into battle, stunning enemies, kind of like the Elite Tauren Chieftain from Heroes of the Storm.
Yes.
Crushing Charge can also knock down trees to help open up paths that would otherwise be closed off.
Something you want to note here for map design, if you're trying to figure out like what units to use, or especially if there's a map that like, oh, it has a double mine in the center, or a double luminite, or double therium, or something like that, you're gonna want to note that this seems to this Rex trees on the Vanguard side, we saw that the Atlas Rex trees, or it's implied that the Atlas Rex trees, and it's definitively the case that Vulcan's Rex trees. So both of them have a tree clearing ability. I want you to note whichever one of these is closer on the tech tree or easier to get to, because I predict that that will have a huge impact on what base layouts are made, what the safety of expansion is, right? The if this is for anyone who's not getting it, if this is super low on the tech tree compared to the Vulcan, then if a map has like a back door that is a backdoor natural or a third base and it's covered by trees, this might not be a very good unit in a straight up fight, but as just a tool to get units through the back, I mean, it just might be good enough. Also note that this makes immediately in 0.5 seconds, so there's a lot here to think about with this unit.
The Magmadon also has a researchable upgrade known as the Flame Coil Lariat, used for helping to deal with flying units by bringing them to the ground.
Okay.
Now let's talk about the Kong.
Something else that wasn't mentioned here, they have the ability Consume. We see the stat for it elsewhere, but Consume allows you to eat a fell hog who comes from a meat farm and gain 50% of the white health of the unit back. Notice that the Magmadon has 240 health, so you're trading a fell hog for 120 Veil.
Deal with flying units by bringing them to the ground.
I also want to note that I don't see any auto cast abilities so far. And that must mean that there's like a strong design impetus to make people be able to outplay one another in fights, and for fights to be the thing that people focus on to gain their advantages, right? With the way that we see buildings shaping up and the way that we see units getting sent out automatically into control groups, the emphasis seems to be that it's just known for years that low-level StarCraft players, low-level RTS players, I'll say more generally, because I played Tooth and Tail and I played obviously, I played Tooth and Tail and LittleWarGame and a bunch of other titles that aren't Blizzard RTSs that you're familiar with. But there's a huge emphasis on the part of newer players and even competent or journeyman players. They don't realize they're slipping back into the trap. You want to watch the fight. And autocasts, unfortunately, make it so that there's less of the fight you actually have to pay attention to and watch. So, not surprising it has
Now
more
let's
abilities.
talk about the Conclave and its Thrall production.
Yes.
The Conclave, again, can also be built to the beginning of the game, but it doesn't have any units that are only Luminite. So this is something that you generally will see as kind of a later tech than the Iron Vault.
I want to say something from LittleWarGame that we've experienced. Dragons and werewolves are supposed to be in LittleWarGame tier 2, tier 3 units, right? They're supposed to be in that upper echelon of something that you get later to round out your composition to prevent a threat, to present a new threat to your opponents, to add multidimensionality to your composition. Yet we see people do rushes of these units. Like, we see people do rushes like make a werewolf, put it inside of a make a werewolf, put it inside of an airship, and drop it on our opponents. So just because these units require Therium doesn't and aren't Luminite exclusive, I wouldn't bet that they're not going to be used in a rush. Now, Gaunts, which he's about to talk about, I would be very surprised if those are actually used in a rush beyond like a really, really strict one base drop rush with the goal is of sniping all of your opponents, imps and bobs, and just wrecking them with the fiends coming over and. But the other unit that was there was the Weaver. So let's pay attention to how good the Weaver is as we get introduced to Gaunts. Um, also note that Gaunts were praised on the cast as being a very particularly strong or commonplace unit for the Infernal faction, and we're going to learn why in a second.
The main unit the Conclave produces is the Gaunt. The Gaunt is an inexpensive range unit that hits both air and ground, and it has a bouncing attack.
By the way, this also implies that the damage that it deals. Notice how the Magmadon had the Flame Coil Lariat and was able to bring units down to the ground. I want to note that if there is an ability that pulls units to the ground, this reflects that the designer, one, doesn't want air units or air skyball armies to be terrifying. We've also seen deliberate splitting and reduction of clumping of air units. And I find it interesting that the Gaunt hits air and ground, yet there is an ability that specifically pulls air units to the ground. It seems like there are overlapping fields here of not letting air units be a problem. And just as a longtime lurker, no, not Brood War lurker, not the one that does 20 damage to you underground with spines, although, we'll get to that later. But as a longtime lurker of Reddit and watching other people's StarCraft streams and listening to how people talk about RTS, particularly people who are trying to improve at any level in RTS, any level below Grandmaster, I'm just not close enough to those people to know. Yeah, a lot of people complain about air units. How do I deal with air units? Air units are so fast. Air units just run away. They ignore terrain. Looks like there's a deliberate design decision here to kind of overcompensate for the air problem. But that's all we're watching Gaunts for.
The Gaunt's offensive abilities
By the way,
ground, and it has a bouncing attack. The Gaunt's
oh, hi, Fiend.
offensive abilities kind of feel like they pale in comparison to like a Marine, a Roach, or even an Exo from the.
They look like snakes from LittleWarGame. If you don't know, snakes in LittleWarGame are the parallel for the beast faction of archers, which is the Rax. The snake in LittleWarGame has almost double the attack speed of an archer, but a little less. I think they have half the range, and definitely they have half the damage. And so that's the relationship that's going on here. It looks like you want to make more Gaunts than you want to make Exos. Notice that we did the Vanguard video and reaction previously, where we saw that Exos had 150 health, and this is like 100 at best, maybe 120 if some like little pixelation is not clear here. So these units are much lighter.
Vanguard. But that's before they get their Hemoglaive infusion upgrade. This upgrade is somewhat similar to Stim, dealing damage to the Gaunt, but increasing its damage. And
want to notice that he said increasing its damage, not increasing its attack speed or movement speed. And so we should now be thinking about how armor in the game functions. If you are curious in how armor in the game functions, I don't have that answer, but if you want to know what the armor statistics are that we're aware of, again, use the command.
Causing damaged units, that's units that the Gaunt is hitting, to become infested for a short period of time.
Yes.
Now, when a unit is infested, if it dies, it will spawn a fiend, and that fiend will join your army. So obviously, as this sounds, it can help turn the tides or snowball an already won fight if your opponent doesn't retreat when it's appropriate to. The second unit created the...
Okay, so something to talk about here. I've already kind of given the logic as to why the Vanguard is the movement faction. This is probably one of the reasons, this unit, the Gaunt, as to why people seem to publicly state, other streamers seem to publicly state, that they find that, I don't know if, some have said it's easier, others have said that the Infernals are just stronger. And this is likely a big part of the reason why. Because the Gaunts If your opponent is playing the game like they want to create an army, stand and deliver, and fight, regardless of their faction, and you have a unit that if their units die, you start spawning more units, and you have the brute, this big like super tanky hitting unit, right? Then this becomes a battle of fiends. Lots of fiends getting generated. Infestations generating fiends, infestations generating fiends, and these gaunts are generating fiends, and as we'll find out later, the flayed dragon is also generating fiends. And so the matchup very quickly becomes one in which DPS density, or the effective unit counters, kind of fly out the window, because what you're biggest, as soon as a gaunt or a brute or the flayed dragon is in a fight, an infestation is a question, that means fiends are a problem. The biggest thing you have to figure out is, how do I win stage 2 of the fight? Let's assume that I'm doing well and I'm winning stage 1, and it or it's even, and it devolves into a fiend versus fiend fight. What units are effective at killing fiends? That's what I want you to pay attention to as we're going forward, because if you get into these fiend v fiend breakdowns, which will start as soon as anyone commits to the fight or is forced to commit to the fight, right? Then whoever has the most units that aren't fiends wins, because more of their units will become fiends or generate more fiends, right? And also, seemingly, this faction doesn't have an Atlas or a Vulcan or something like that, whose dedicated purpose seems to be to wreck fiends and was explicitly mentioned as such. I want to notice something else that we can see at the bottom here. We can not only see it through the animation as they're attacking this building, going over to the command post, it's also down here, one of the abilities of the we see that this unit, the Gaunt, is selected, and they have bouncing bone axes. We're going to just back up a little bit so you can
Ball
see.
and already
Watch this.
one
You see how that is striking over there? So whether this is an upgrade or a passive ability, we don't know. But let's think about how crazy good that is for the Gaunt. It's a unit that can turn on a hemoglobin infusion and make it so that everything that it strikes becomes infested for a period of time. And it has bouncing axes, so that any one attack hits multiple to generate more fiends. That's kind of wild. That's kind of wild.
fight if your opponent doesn't retreat.
Definitely a source of units. Like, definitely one of the units we want to take a look at is, if we're trying to figure out, is this overpowered? This would be one of the units I would want to poke my head towards and try to figure out the timings for. Although, interestingly, I don't think an army of all fiends, or rather of all fiends, that would be sick. I don't think an army of all gaunts is actually as crazy as it's jacked up to be. Let's think about this. If you have 100 gaunts against 10 enemies, your raw DPS might win. But let's say they have, that your raw DPS won't do it. You infest. You do hemoglobin infusion. All of your gaunts are doing bouncing glaives that seem to bounce at least one time, right? And infest anything they hit. Now, it's possible they don't hit the secondary, tertiary, later on targets. But let's pretend that they do, because we have no indication that they don't, okay? If you have 100 gaunts, and you're hitting all 10 of those enemy units, well, they're all infested after a handful of the Gaunt strike. Unless the DPS of the Gaunt is that good, do you really need all of them to do this? Another thing is, we didn't see anything, though, that indicated that fiends themselves can't be hit with the infest to then themselves become more fiends, right? So, just something to think about. Like, does this combat breakdown continue all the way down? I think we will get to the point where, unless the DPS of Gaunts is just crazy, you're just going to make enough Gaunts to make sure that your opponent respects the threat of infestation, or of their whole army becoming fiends, and then the whole thing's cascading into a fucking nightmare, right? That's it. I don't think we're going to have, like, all the Gaunts, right? Like, much like how if we see even a pranks in LittleWarGame, even if we have a prankster gangster wolf snake army, and snakes don't have this infestability, but they're similar in that they're a short range, low hit point, seemingly rapid fire unit. You have enough wolves to cover the front line, and then snakes for days. Or, more commonly, you have a lot of wolves to trap the opponent and hold them in place, and then the snakes just provide some DPS, right? Just get some more in there. I think that's what we'll see Gaunts end up doing. This actually looks like a support unit. More, unless it's goaded for cost or things like that. But if you want to learn more about the costs, again,
retreat when
Don't
it's
make me say
appropriate
it.
to.
I'll point to the sun.
The second unit created at the Conclave is called the Weaver. The Weaver is a heavy, slow thrall unit with an amazing ability called
Once again, 750 health, 375 Veil. We are undefeated in Veil being 50% of the health of something.
Lash. Lash is...
Want to note the range on that too. So in the Vanguard video, we saw that the Lancer had what in LittleWarGame terms would be about range 1.
Heavy,
right? Range 1, maybe like range 1.5 in
slow
terms of
thrall
its
unit
range.
with an
I want to note here.
amazing ability called Lash.
So it looks like it is a point and click. Once you click on the unit, you abduct it, essentially. He's going to make the comparison to Vipers very shortly. The range that this represents in LittleWarGame would be something like 8. Range 8 or 9. And we can see that actually it looks to be about half of the screen vertical, right? Now that's a little bit stretched because of the perspective, because for anyone who doesn't know, if you're looking at a game that is rendered in uses three-dimensional models, and it's not faking it like Octopath Traveler style, but it's like legitimately 3D, where your camera is centered is going to affect and skew the perspective that you get of lines. Right, like so, if the center of the camera is here, it may actually stretch to look like it's further on than it is. And I notice that the hook is all the way out here, even though it's affecting the unit out here. And also, this looks like it's on a cooldown and doesn't use any secondary resource, right? So this is not a spell-gated unit. Also, this reinforces the idea that I haven't seen anything so far that's actually good at initiating. I know the Magmadon looks like it's going to hit and slow things, but that slow isn't initiation so much to me as it is we catch up to hit you. The big initiators that I've seen so far are fiends are just so fast that they initiate by forcing you to deal with the problem. And frankly, the Magmadon can like hit something as it's retreating, but that's not a full initiation. Right? It also doesn't look quite tanky enough to just jump in and say, all right, like you're not actually ready. So this is kind of all with the Weaver Slash being a single target ability, kind of reinforcing to me that rather than Zerg, where they're more on a macro level, right, on a strategy level, Zerg is map control, knowledge of what your opponent is going to do, economy, and then make sure that we have enough to deal with the threats that'll come to us, right? That's a severe oversimplification, right? It's very much but it's very much informed by what the faction does. All of the units I'm seeing here look like stand and deliver units, right? Like if we were playing like infinite money, zero clutter maps in which you spawned at distances like this, Infernals would love it for days. And if you were playing on a map that was like stretched like this, I mean, I feel like Infernals can win any fight, but they just struggle to actually get to the fight because a lot of these tools are not defensive. Magmadon, you're not really defensively sliding in with the Magmadon, right? Infest is like kind of a skill check of your opponent, but you're not defensively infesting, or you're not defensively using the Hemoglyph infusion to try and threaten infestation on your opponent. If your opponent is that strong that they're going to win the fight, they're not going to not win the fight because you've threatened to infest their stuff, right? If it was clear they were going to win from the start, is the Weaver going to sneak behind anything and lash it out of position? No, these are stand and deliver units. This is why I referenced it as being similar to Rax in LittleWarGame. I want to make sure all of my walls are protected. I have a set number of bases. I get to an arbitrary supply amount through which you can no longer ignore the problem. Then I take the fight in one place and beat you to death with it. Right? And that's what the Weaver looks like to me.
Lash is basically abduct from the StarCraft 2's Viper. It grabs a unit and drags it into the Weaver.
I predict that it is going to, in a battle of jockeying positions, it's going to grab units so that you can pick them off one at a time, especially versus Vanguard, because a lot of Vanguard units, their defense, if you will, is that they're fast. Well, there's no defense, because right now it's showing it in 1v1, 1v1, 1v3 scenario to give you an idea as to what the ability does, but I don't think what's going to happen is your opponent is going to just be like, all right, commit to the full fight, and then you pull something in, right? You're going to have your army dancing over here and their army dancing over here, and the instant one of their hedgehogs, if it's Vanguard, or there doesn't seem to be a size restriction here, so the instant maybe one of their weavers gets close, you just pull the thing and go from there.
Now, I'm normally an RTS player who doesn't really care about graphics or style at all.
Okay.
But the Weaver is the creepiest unit I've ever seen, and I absolutely love the way that it shambles around. I just kind
Also, shape language is triangles. Triangle is scary, dangerous enemy. Like if we were to snipping tool this, just follow my mouse like nah nah nah. Like look at it, look at this. It's a triangle. It looks like it's gonna come wreck you. Its face is itself a triangle. This thing looks dangerous, and more importantly, while there are a lot of humanoid looking enemies, you can just tell what this is immediately on the ground. That's kind of sick.
of have to add that in there. As soon as I saw the Weaver,
Oh, of course.
I mean, you get this very different feel from it. A very, very cool unit to see.
Yes.
Next, let's talk about flying units made from the Twilight Spire.
Okay. I want to notice that there are 2 units here, so you probably want to make 1 or 2. You probably want to make 2 spires, especially since
the Spriggan.
I want to go back 1 second. Forgive me for being.
Let's talk about flying units
notice,
made from the Twilight Spire.
I want you to notice. Watch the bars that are here, and this seems to be in real time, not like fastest, not like ×4 multiplier. Note how quickly they advance. That's it. That's all you saw. You saw 2 ticks over the period of the couple of seconds that we were there. So you probably want 2 or 3 of these.
Spriggan is somewhat similar to the Star.
I want to notice also with the air units, because we're going to get all the way deep into this. That's right. We're going maximum depth. Notice that in it doesn't look like there is a deliberate ability. It looks like deliberately there is not an ability for you to stack these units up such that they're inside of their collision circles. Right? Now, that may be because for the purpose of the video and demonstration, we want the units to be split up. But the fact that none of the later clips even accidentally show the units clumping together in this way kind of indicates a couple of things. 1, we want to be able to focus fire air units. 2, we don't want them to be able to group together like a pack of zebras so that you can't tell what you're focus firing, and so they just get away with some random amount of health between all of them, right?
Warcraft 2 Mutalisk. It's a flying unit which can attack air and ground, which seems perfect for hit and run harassment or for punishing an army with insufficient anti-air. It does cost a lot of Therium, though, so massing them can be a bit difficult.
They also seem to be hitting some kind of debuff. Notice the purple aura that's around here. When we last saw this purple aura on the med tech, it was state that this would be dealing damage over time or a debuff to attack to the struck enemies. And notice that we've also seen this multiple times, that blue shimmer aura that goes around someone. So the blue shimmer aura seems to be a placeholder for buff. That doesn't otherwise have like a green aura to indicate healing, and this purple aura seems to be an indication of debuff, right?
Lastly, from the Twilight Spire is the Doombringer.
Also, I want to note that Spriggans were actually used in TLO versus Mana Game 2, and they almost crushed TLO's soul. So this is the Doombringer. It's also called the Harbinger once it lands.
The Doombringer is the flying transport unit for the Infernal, but with a bit of a twist compared to conventional air transports. To load or unload the Doombringer, you have to land it. This
My gosh, imagine the people of LittleWarGame if we did this. Now, I want to note that I said before that the Infernals look a lot like the LittleWarGame Rax army. And the way that you fight as Rax in LittleWarGame, if you want to have a Rax or even a Rax Mech battle, particularly against Beast, against the faster units, the faster faction, if you will, the faster choices, you tend to use your airship to drop units that, if you're playing Rax Mech, you drop an Atlas, essentially, to use Stormgate terms. But if you're just playing Rax, you drop soldiers. The reason you drop soldiers is that they're fairly inexpensive. They are really good at they're slower than the enemy workers, but they can do some good damage against buildings if left unimpeded, and they're quite tanky. So I think that what you're going to be seeing people use Doombringers for except for the exploding imps that we'll get to in a bit. What we're actually going to see people use Doombringers for, I'm pretty sure, is drop brutes. Think about it. Brutes are already pretty strong, seem really good one-on-one. This overcomes the brutes' difficulty in moving across terrain and their slow speed, and brutes can split into fiends. This seems great, especially in the mirror, by the way. I can't imagine my opponent bringing a Doombringer, calling it a Harbinger, generating Shroud, and then doing all this nonsense.
Obviously makes the Doombringer a lot more vulnerable than other transports,
Yes.
but it generates Shroud around it when landed. The Shroud makes all the Infernal units generate white health and provides an advantage in battle because of this.
The white health is Veil. We call it Veil in this chat, and I will push for that until we actually get it. I want to note something here is that it is a weakness for the Doombringer to deploy and call itself a Harbinger, but something that I don't think people are considering is that when it deploys into this Shroud, the benefit of Shroud is essentially hit point regeneration over time. For the Infernal faction, to a lesser extent than the Medtech, if we're using another RTS, LittleWarGame, this is generating a giant healing ward along it at the cost of this unit being, like, stable, right? That's it. All you have to do is keep it still on the ground, and it's a giant support tower that is casting heal on all of your units. We also don't know if the rate at which Veil, the white health, goes up is a proportion or if it is a flat value. Right? Like, are Magmadons and Weavers just disproportionately buffed by getting this? Do they get a percentage of their Shroud? Does the Shroud give them a percentage of Veil? Or do they get a static amount of Veil? If they get a static amount of Veil, this is important. If the Harbinger generates a static amount of Veil when landed, then that disproportionately benefits small, low Veil count units, right? Because in order for it to be relevant for powerful units, it has to be an extremely high rate of return and Veil generation for those small units. Now, what if it's percentage based, right? What if you're just getting like 5% per 1 second or something like that? This is a number that's used in other games as well. Right, not for Veil, but other RTSs do something like this, where they give you flat X percentage over X period of discrete time. Okay, well, if you're getting percentage over time, then the thing that has a bigger base value gets more out of the percentage. We talked about how the Magmadon has 240 Veil, I think it is. Imagine if you were getting 5% of that Veil per second. You're healing 12 health per second, and note that it's kind of like a shield, because I strongly suspect that once you lose Veil, then the difference of what the damage was that you took that exceeds your Veil comes out of your hit points. So you are passively in a health regenerative state when you're inside of this. This feeds back into the idea, right, that Infernals is a stand and deliver faction. Even their airship. Look at this thing. Even their airship deploys and then gives healing to everything in there as long as it stays over the benefit of just being highly mobile like the Vanguard version.
It's kind of similar to the StarCraft 2 Overlords, as they can go into battle and drop creep to give that speed boost to Zerg units. But I do think this will maybe see a bit more play than that Overlord creep dropping that we ever saw in StarCraft.
This also strongly implies, by the way, that Shroud is a prerequisite for building buildings. Right? Which means that actually the ability to fast expand is probably a bit different. Now, they may have just done this to show that it's on Shroud and that that's a good idea. This is the width of the Shroud area, but I find that very hard to believe.
StarCraft 2. You know, I mentioned before the Imp is very much like a drone, sacrificing itself to make a building.
Yes.
But later on, you can upgrade Flame On. When Flame On is activated, the Imp becomes something pretty close to a StarCraft 2 Baneling. They can sacrifice themselves while dealing splash damage to the enemy. Shadow Flyers.
Okay, the first thing people are going to do with Imps, by the way, if they're not already doing it, is they're going to find out how many of them are required to one-shot workers, and they're going to drop them over the Therium and the Luminite. That's the first thing that they're going to do. Now, I don't know what the competitive StarCraft 2 history of Baneling drops is and why that got changed. I know there was some hullabaloo from the Balance Council about how Baneling +2 does not interact with probes and drones relative to Terran SCVs. But I want to note that we don't have a suicide unit or like an off-yourself explosive unit like this inside of LittleWarGame. We have had mods that try to bring in something like this, and what's interesting is that I don't think that they're bad, but they tend to attract the kind of player who would be better served by not making them. And so what I mean by that is you feel like a megalodon genius when you use something that self-destructs to get more value, but it doesn't look like you have the ability to stop the flame on. And I don't know if you have the ability to manually detonate them either. And both of these present a pretty big control problem where it says, well, the only transport unit is, it doesn't look like imps get faster on Shroud. We've already mentioned that they're an 80-40 unit. I would need to know, do they get bonus movement speed when they use Flame On? Can you manually detonate it? How many of them are required to destroy something? Right? Now, one thing that's good about this really is that because of the way that your essential shrines work and the production structure works for Infernals generally, you probably, speculation, are going to generate more ability to make imps than you're going to want. I guarantee you at some point in the game, if you make the game go long enough, you're going to want more than the 12 imps that are here, and you're going to have more charges than in the shrine, but you'll have 12 in, in Luminite and 5 in Therium, right? And what that means is, what are you going to use these charges for? So risk reward supply is a very important thing here. That said, the way that the Flame On Imps work seems at odds with the way that their Doombringer / Harbinger's transport vehicle works and what's most effective about it. So unless you're hoping to do the equivalent of catapult drops and just surprise your opponent and wreck them that way, I only see that as maybe a way when you're into. So I'm using a LittleWarGame parable similarity. In LittleWarGames, sometimes you will go for. There are some maps where the rush distance by air is so close that you will do something like rush an airship and then attack your opponent. But while they're trying to get what they think is a safe third base, and you're bouncing around between 3 points of interaction and you use the delay period to get your own third base. It wouldn't surprise me if this is the after we're safe in our naturals opening tech choice is to get Flame On, because hey, you already have access to the shrine, which produces the imps anyways, and Flame On is an ability that you can get that turns those things that you're already generating charges for into value anyways. And then your tech is really not them. Your tech is really the Doombringer / Harbinger, which, we've just seen across RTSs. If your micro is good enough, a flying transport unit is good.
Are the other unit made by the Shrine, and they're really similar to Scourge from StarCraft 1. They sacrifice themselves into other air units for massive damage and don't have any sort of ground attack or anything like that.
I want to note before. Oh.
You can also get an upgrade called Bright Blood, and that'll make them more effective at killing those air units off.
I want to notice that this moving area right here is has been Blizzard shorthand for a long time for autocast, right? Or continuous use. Okay. So this looks like one of those rare abilities where you don't actually have to pay attention to the unit in order to use it, although there is also a manual activation, right? So this implies that there is enough extra AoE that you might choose to suicide the unit, like an air baneling. Jokes write themselves on this one. I do want to note that we actually saw an interaction with this unit with the Hornet in the Vanguard video, where the Vanguard Hornet was dropped a sky mine, and then the Shadow Flyer ran around it and then got booped by the sky mine. So the comparison to Scourge seems apt from what I can tell just from the hit point interactions, unless the sky mine or the Hornet is just goated and that's what its purpose is, and it's just that good. This just looks like a very low health unit that defensively you'll use it to get rid of your opponent's transport units, sometimes as a measure of last resort against their own flyers, or in mirror matches to gain air superiority. We see this, I mean, even at the low level that I understand the game, we see this in Brood War, right? Scourge and Mutalisks, because you want Mutalisks, but Scourge can also be valuable, but Mutalisks can kill drones, and there's that, like, dynamic going on. I feel like the Shadow Flyer will probably struggle to do that because most of the maps seem to have as a percentage a lot of the, from what we've seen of the games, a lot of the maps have a lot of their, most of their surface covered by ground. As in, there are places flying units can go that skip over terrain problems for ground units, but there's very few places where the air units can go that ground units just can't actually technically reach. And this does look like it's about as fast as a not returning to Hangar Bay Hornet. So the speed comparison there is pretty good. I do worry about how this unit is actually going to do its job against the like speed boosted evac that Vanguards have. But another thing is that also it is a flying unit in a game where there's a lot of negatives to having flying units because you can't just stack this unit up, right? We haven't seen air units stack despite opportunities for players in real games where it would have been highly beneficial for them to stack up their air units together. And so when your air units don't clump together and you have a suicide self-exploding air unit, then they can be picked off more easily. The count of them can be seen more easily. They can be respected for their count. Like, one of the benefits of clumping your air units together is that you make it hard for your opponent to understand exactly how many air units you have, aka what force you have to bring to bear. So I actually think that some of these things are going to make the Shadow Flyer in need of buffs. Just because of the nature of the unit and of the engine and the decisions that have been made to nerf air going into it.
There is one last thing that kind of has one last unit in it that we do need to go over here as well.
Sure.
And that would be the Infernal Shroudstone. The Shroudstone is the static defense building for the faction.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 means that it has something between 401 or 400 to 449 hit points.
It also collects something called Animus. Animus is kind of like spell energy, which is collected as units die around your units. So
By the way, pay attention to this because this aspect of the Shroudstone and Animus is one of the biggest things tying together all of these things I've talked about why Infernals look like the stand and deliver faction. They are literally getting rewarded on a gameplay mechanic, on a gameplay level, for having as much blood and carnage in the game as possible.
this could be your units or your opponent's units. And there's a bonus if they die on Shroud.
I want to notice that when it says your units or your opponent's units, can we use Gaunts and their infestation ability to hit our own fiends, infest them, kill them, and generate more fiends, which we then target to infest and kill? Like, is there a... You know how we have, like, Roach Max? There was, in StarCraft 2, there was Roach Max. And then also we had the idea, if for Zerg players, of practicing creep spread, right? You would have maps where you could go and you could practice how quickly you could get 100%, 70%, 30% of the map covered in creep, in what time interval, and you would get rewards for that. It was like a micro trainer, a mechanics trainer for the game. Can you target your own units, and then if they die, use Gaunts to target your own units, turn on your ability, infest your unit, make fiends, target the fiends, make more fiends over and over? Like, is there Animus any percent, right? For anyone who knows speed running. That is something I would immediately look at as, can you just play a super solid defensive Infernals game and just kill these fiends that are already going to die anyways, right? Because it does say dies near your units, whether they're your units or enemy units. Just saying. Like, I remember Brood War, there were a lot of tricky Brood War maps where they would give you a queen, and your queen would have to infest, like, spawn Broodling on a unit.
The spells for the Shroudstone are Bring Darkness. This can be cast anywhere on the map, causing an area of effect infest, which will create fiends.
Okay. I mean, obviously, the valuation of each of these and how much animus it requires for these to be done is a huge component as to whether or not these will be usable abilities. We saw that the maximum animus of the Shroudstone was 1,000, so if all of these take 1,000, then some are definitely awful. If all of them take 1, then they're pretty hilariously broken in all respects. So, Infest, yeah, what really matters here for the Bring Darkness ability is we need to see, can you use this before you have a critical mass of gaunts as a one-time don't defend this. I'm gonna attack, don't defend this or I'll wreck you.
It also has Blood Moon. This will give a large boost to white health regeneration rate for a short time. There's
Yep, so bonus Veil healing. I want to know immediately whenever I hear a bonus or additive what it stacks with. Does this stack with the Harbinger's Shroud ability?
Nightfall Infestation. This will create another Shroudstone, but it has to be pretty close to the Shroudstone that casts it.
Okay, a couple of things with this is how early is this available? Can you tower rush with this? What's the mana cost of it? Because Shroudstones, their defensive prowess looked okay. I'm curious as to what the thought is for this, other than the Shroudstone itself generates Shroud. If you're the stand and deliver faction, the closer you get your Shroud to your opponent, the more likely you are to just fight them. But this seems weirdly at odds to me with the Harbinger, right? With the Deathbringer, the Harbinger. Because why would I not just get the tanky flying unit that is all tanky flying transport unit and generate this stuff myself? Rather than create buildings forward, the only benefit I can think of is if there are points on the map that strategically you're benefiting in a disproportionate faction. Like, there's 3 roads, right? And you just need to hold this area, and then you have access to all 3 roads, right? This is where that ability comes in pretty well, like pretty usefully. But it looks more like a defensive ability than an offensive one. Actually, these are the closest things to defensive abilities that we've actually seen from the faction.
And last but certainly not least, Summon Flayed Dragon. This is a
That's a lot of Veil. I'm gonna assume, by the way, based on how low the Shroudstone is here, we don't know what percentage was used, right? So again, if you use the command, you can go on Reddit, you can see all the stats that you can lift from this and from other videos, and it gives us some additional information about at least what was inside of this version of the game. Right, this PTR. I want to note it, however, that you see how much of the Animus has been drained right down here in the bottom section underneath of the Shroudstone, and we know it's the same Shroudstone because it's damaged to the same extent. It looks like almost all of it was used, and given that it was introduced from left to right, generally, we know this from League of Legends, right? Or from MOBAs or from Warcraft 3, or you just know it from playing games, right? If you have abilities and they're introduced from left to right, because we're in an English culture and we read left to right, right is the end of the sentence. It is the end of the thought. It is the predicate. That means that it tends to be the most powerful set of abilities, right? Think of QWER or ZXCV or ASDF, right? If you're coming from an FPS genre. So Veeb, and this being the only one that makes a unit, right? What I'm getting at is this looks like it spawns with full Veil, and if its Veil is 50% of its health, and this is an end game unit that requires a lot of Animus, like holy shit, this is gonna be a monstrous unit.
really expensive spell that makes a gigantic flying dragon.
I want to notice here. Okay. We actually have damage from the hunker down from the Vanguard video. We know that these hedgehogs can transform into a thing that has hunker down. Hunker down does it looks like 30 to 40 damage per shot. Okay. I want to
Which
note there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 seemingly of these things. 14. Each volley of 14. That's crazy. Doing 30 to 40 damage. That's 420 to 560 damage. And we again can get a quick count if you just want to like count, countula. Take a look with me. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Remember that each of these are remember that each of these are in fact
Expensive
50
spell
hit
that makes
points
a
per.
gigantic flying dragon.
Okay, cool. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. 18 times 50 is very often 900. So this thing has 900 to 949 hit points. And if we assume that it did spawn with full Veil, and we assume that it has its Veil is equal to half of its health, this thing has 900 hit points and 450 Veil, which is like absurd. That's an absurd. That's like, and this is a dedicated anti-air unit, by the way.
Which
Like,
can infest enemy units.
like, look at again. This is. I want to stress. This does die quickly, and he has a sad emote over here about him. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 10, 13, 15. 15 of these doing 30 to 40 damage each. That's 450 to 600 damage per hit, right? And it took like 3 volleys to Shrek through what we imagine is about 900 health. So this seems good.
It's basically at your whim. It's an incredibly strong unit, but pretty hard to get to.
Huh? What's up? What's up? Let me get you something. 1 sec. Yeah, the delay there in the center will probably be taken out for the YouTube video, but this part probably won't be. Take care of your family. Make sure they have food. There you go. You learned it from the best. Okay.
So I hope that this has helped you a little bit, trying to draw some parallels between the Stormgate Infernal units and other units in RTS games that you may have watched or played in the past. I hope that you enjoyed and that it helped you in some ways. And guys, thank you very much for watching, and good luck in Stormgate.